So, David, here we are. It is the middle of July. We are now over 135,000 deaths. We just, I think, this week it was reported that Texas and Arizona, Texas in particular, has ordered over a dozen FEMA movable morgues and mobile morgues. I think Arizona has ordered some as well. It's conceivable that we'll see that in Florida soon. California is having a spike. Now, Oklahoma is having issues, South Carolina. Um, and you and I spoke on the Majority Report, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago. I can't really, to be honest with you, keep things straight.
What is time? Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, let's start with this. From the perspective of the virus in and of itself, I mean, what are the things? Where are we in terms of our knowledge about its transmittability?
Well, in general, our understanding hasn't evolved that much over the last month or 6 weeks. It's still a disastrously transmittable disease. There's still a huge lag between the time when you get the disease and when you start to feel symptoms. And maybe even most concerningly, in trying to get a handle on it, is the fact that as many as half of all transmission comes from asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic people, which means that, if you're only testing people who feel sick, you're almost by design missing half or more of the problem. And that's really the state we're still in, even in those places where we're rolling out an enormous number of tests today. We're not doing surveillance level, population level testing. We're only doing testing of people who already feel sick. And those people are not getting test results for 5 days, 7 days, in some cases 2 weeks, which means the results are basically useless to them if they were, either they should be or will, quarantine preemptively, or by the time they get the results back, the period in which they should have been quarantining is over. And so this is a problem that has been, facing the U.S. since January, February, when we were first thinking about the threat of COVID. Somehow 6 months later, it's no better. We have a testing apparatus which, while a lot bigger than it was in January or February, actually isn't all that much more effective in helping us control the disease. And that's one reason among many, why we're having such a catastrophic resurgence or second wave, or however you want to talk about what's happening now. In truth, it's a little misleading to talk about it as a second wave, because in most places where there are dramatic outbreaks, they didn't have a first one. And there's, when we conflate national data, it looks different than when you look at regions in particular. But in many parts of the country, you're going through something like what New York went through in the spring. And the scariest part is that, of course, there are many more parts of the country still that haven't yet done that. And because there is what the head of, or one of the doctors of the CDC called, so much virus in the country, it's going to be really, really hard to contain the spread such that we won't see many more outbreaks like those we're now seeing in Houston and Miami and all across Arizona, in all the rest of the country over the next few weeks and months. And that's, I think, one of the things that is scariest and most distressing, that people don't really yet seem to realize, that, things are really bad right now, but they're going to get a lot worse. And that's true at the level of the disease. Personally, I'm even more worried about it, I think, at the level of the social and economic cost, because we had a report out this week showing that 28 million people may face eviction because of the crisis. We have, the moment, an 11% unemployment rate, but it's actually higher than that. That's sort of misleading. And the extended unemployment benefits are going to run out this month. We've got more than 5 million people who lost health insurance as a result of the pandemic. It's looking like almost nowhere in the country will schools be truly open in the fall, which means that all of those kids are going to lose at the very least 6 months of schooling and maybe more. We're seeing suicides skyrocket, overdosing skyrocket, anxiety levels off the charts, Xanax prescriptions off the charts. And all of these costs, these psychic costs, these economic costs, these social costs, are going to get much, much worse in the fall, in part because the federal government is so disinterested in doing anything to cushion that suffering. And really the earliest relief we can start to hope for from the federal level is going to come only in January, hopefully with a new president, a new House, and ideally a new Senate as well. And that's really a long way off given how much people are suffering today.
I mean, it's a real long way off when you contemplate the idea that we're only 4 months into this, right? In terms of like when the sort of the first wave hit the beach, if you will, we're only 4 months into this, and there's not that at least in the context of New York, and I mean I think like this is the failure of the federal government to act, and in fact I would say it's even worse than their failure to act. I mean they actively worked against what are the minimum basics you need. I mean just the fact that you are a professional writer writing about this on a regular basis, and the fact that we can't even articulate in a way that is understood across the board as to whether this is the first or the second wave is indicative of the fact that there has been such an incomprehensible, such a disparate reaction to this, right? Like because I don't know if we could say it's a first wave, but that's a function of where you are in the country. I mean, that's the thing, is that we can't even define a lot of these terms because of the haphazard way in which the response has taken place. And
it's been totally criminal at the federal level in particular. I mean, I mentioned, the testing issues. There has been literally no federal initiative to coordinate or fund the rollout of testing at any mass scale. We're going through PPE.
There's hostility towards testing. I mean, like
absolutely.
Every day, Donald Trump has an interview and is asked about a question. He expresses hostility towards testing. And so and just to be clear with everybody, I want to just tease out that point that you made. We're testing a lot more people, but relative to the spread of the disease, we are actually lagging where we were back in April, right? The disease has spread, the virus has spread so much that the amount that we're testing is now insufficient. And like you say, or at least our testing capacity, because a test that you get back in 12 or 14 days is definitionally useless. It's telling you something that is literally useless information at that point.
Yeah, and we were told early on in the spring that we needed to do absolutely everything that we needed to suppress the spread, at least enough to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. And now, in certain parts of the country, they are being overwhelmed. Arizona has activated what they call their crisis standards of care, which means they're basically allowing hospitals to make decisions about who to treat and not to treat, because the hospitals are so full up that they can't treat everybody who comes in. The ICUs are already overfilled in all through Florida, dozens of counties in Florida. And the scariest and maybe most depressing thing about it is that while that seemed like a horrible prospect when we first heard about it in February and March, and we were like, we needed to do absolutely everything we could to prevent it from happening. It's happening now, and the public doesn't really bat an eye. Obviously there is enormous concern about this disease and its spread, but I think simultaneously we are really normalizing an enormous amount of suffering and pain and dying that we really, really, by any moral standard, should not be. And when you look at what's happened elsewhere in Europe, I think it's especially kind of illustrative and showcases just how much of a failure we are walking through, because the countries of Europe also failed at first. In general, all the countries of the West didn't adequately understand the scale of the threat when it first arose in Asia. You look at other countries in Asia, they saw what was going on in China, and they freaked out because they knew how serious it was. Nobody across the West did that, which meant that everybody was caught flat-footed at first, and just about everybody, had a really bad first set of experiences with this disease, as the U.S. did. So on some level, you can't fault the initial failure. You can't fault us for the initial failure because all of our peer countries did the same. But all of those other peer countries took the opportunity of lockdowns to build out public health infrastructure, testing capacities, contact tracing, and also to really inform the public about what was needed to do to suppress the spread of the disease, such that every single other country, all of our peer countries, have really dramatically turned the corner on this. And in many parts of Europe, it's basically over. Like, they're going to still have some cases here and there, but there's so much public health focus on the disease that they have it completely under control in a totally reliable way. Here in the U.S., we've basically given up. And that is really depressing, distressing, and horrifying, given that, we're at 135,000 deaths now. The best projection models by this guy, Yu Gu, suggest that we're going to have, by November 1st, about 225,000. So we're only about halfway through the dying that we're likely to see by Election Day. And, of course, we're learning every day that this disease really damages you even if you survive. There are patients, even patients who had quote-unquote mild experiences of the disease, who have noticeable damage in their lungs and in their hearts. We don't know how long that'll last. We don't know exactly how pervasive it is. But this is a really horrifying disease whose cost is much bigger even than the 135,000 people who've died or the 225,000 who are likely to die, which, given the scale of those numbers, it's just a moral abomination to think that they don't even contain the scale of the suffering. The scale of the suffering and pain is much, much bigger still.
Let me ask you just a couple of questions about what you just said. In terms of the long-term damage, do we have any sense of, like, are there numbers out there? I mean, I have heard there are potential long-term neurological damage, which, certainly makes some sense. I mean, certainly, like, the pandemic of 1918, there was grave neurological issues associated with that flu. Some suggest that even Wilson, you could draw a line from that flu and who caught it at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles to World War II. But do we have and also, like you say, the hearts, the lungs? I've heard of kidney failure. Do we have any numbers on that? And which then we can actually lead into the other question I had for you was, what are the implications of the White House announcing that the CDC is no longer going to be in the loop in collecting data, COVID-19 data, that it's going to be kept sort of like very close to the White House at Health and Human Services?
Well, on the long-term stuff, I think basically there have been no large-scale studies of long-term impact. So all that we have are a sort of handful of really small-scale studies, where doctors looked at, a patient group of, say, 20 or 30 patients. And there are some really worrying signs in a lot of those studies, but they are quite small-scale, and it's not yet clear exactly what to make of them. We do know that in the short term, as people experience, acute, severe sickness from COVID, they exhibit symptoms in basically every organ you got. And doctors have, over the course of the disease, stopped thinking of it primarily as a respiratory disease and started thinking of it in part as a blood clotting disease. It does seem to really do a lot of damage through blood clots, which can cause damage almost everywhere in the body. And you see damage just about everywhere in the body, not in every single patient, but at the population level, you see people who have kidney failure, liver failure, heart failure, lung failure, neurological damage, people suffering in their toes and their eyes, sense of smell goes away. All of these things show just how creative this virus is in attacking us. The long-term picture of that is not yet clear, but the more that we learn, the more that we hear, it's sort of anecdotal, but it adds up to something I think quite concerning, is that even people who have mild cases of the disease, or people who had relatively severe experience but then survive, are many of them are going to be dealing with long-term consequences, to some degree. We don't know exactly in what ways, but it's scary. It's something I think most people haven't really quite come to terms with or appreciated yet. The CDC question is, it's a complicated one because, the CDC has really done a pretty terrible job through the pandemic.
Right.
So I want to see that institution restored and built back up and given some more of its political independence that was taken away during the Trump years. But, my own feeling is that I haven't been trusting the CDC as a clearinghouse for data for quite a while. In fact, I've found a lot of the sort of independent journalistic dashboards that have been put together, like, by The Atlantic, for instance, to be a much more useful database, or the website Our World in Data does it really well too. So, I think it's a symptom of the Trump era disease in which but everything has to be managed at the federal level by the White House, while also the White House and the federal government refuses to do anything about anything. That they're taking away this role of the CDC. But I think at least in the short and medium term, it's not going to meaningfully change our understanding of the disease or our ability to see patterns. What's really striking is that most of the large scale data analysis that's been done on this disease to this point has come from abroad, from Chinese scientists, from European scientists. Even though now, in July, and now for a few months, the U.S. has been by far the biggest share of the disease globally,
Right.
which is on its own quite amazing to contemplate. That this is the world's richest nation. As recently as the Ebola outbreak in 2014, it was not just the kind of leading figure in the global health community, but the dominant funder and provider of human resources in any pandemic outbreak anywhere in the world, is now, we haven't just failed in that role. We haven't just abandoned that leadership role. We have so totally failed that we have become the most acute incubator of the disease all around the world. The entire outbreak in Latin America, almost all of that is coming from the United States. And we are the ones who are adding more cases every day than basically everybody else in the world. That is an incredible fall from prominence to literally the depths of public health suffering and indifference. And it's happened, if you count the Ebola panic, the Ebola outbreak as the starting point, it's happened in less than half a decade. A lot of that, of course, has to do with Donald Trump, but I also worry about the role of institutions like the CDC and the FDA, which have bungled the pandemic response in their own terms, even below the levels that Trump really, had any impact on himself.
What's happening in terms of university? I mean, now that you mention that, and sometimes it's difficult with these things to assess whether it, how much of it is just a function of I, as a reader of news, no longer pay attention to certain things, or maybe editors, producers of news are like, people don't want to read about this anymore, so we're not going to do these stories. But I do remember 2 or 3 months ago, every other day it was French scientists or doctors say found this attribute, or Italian doctors were warning about that attribute, or Chinese doctors were reporting this or that. And I don't see those type of reports like being generated in this country. And like you say, we have the opportunity for we have the raw product, as it were. And I guess maybe the last thing that I heard was the use of steroids to in some ways diminish the impact of the cytokine storms. But you, as somebody who's been following this on your beat, are you still seeing a steady stream of studies that are pointing to certain things, or have you told me about that in terms of like the possible long-term implications of people who have recovered?
I think in general, we have a clearer sense of how the disease progresses through the period from, the kind of 1 month period from the time you get it to the time where most people are, have either died or have basically passed through to the other side of it. We don't have a very clear sense of the long-term implications, but that's more because, we're only a few months into this pandemic generally. And so we'll learn more about that going forward. But I think there's not that much more to learn. We figured out a lot of these blood clot issues that's helped in treatment. And we have made some sort of marginal breakthroughs in some therapies, some things that, help cut lethality, 10, 20, 30%, which is significant, but not kind of game changing. Some of the questions that I'm most interested in terms of research these days are about matters of that may tell us something more about the future course of the disease epidemiologically, and in particular about a number of questions around the immune response. So, at this point, we often talk about the measuring the degree of spread of the disease through a community through these serological tests. They test to see if you have antibodies in your blood, and basically, New York is the place that has had the highest level anywhere in the world. It's somewhere, depending on the test, somewhere between 20 and 25% of the population has antibodies to COVID. But we've also started to see longitudinal serological surveys that show that antibodies decline quite rapidly, especially in people who had a mild case of the disease, such that a significant portion of them, just 3 months after they were sick, don't show any antibody levels at all in these tests. And the question is, does that mean that they're vulnerable to reinfection? I think the answer to that, having talked to a number of immunologists, is no, and that in fact you can have an immune response that's embedded in so few antibodies that they don't show up on a test, but is still sufficient to fight off a reinfection. In fact, that's a quite common dynamic of diseases like COVID. But what that means then for how we should think about that 20 to 25% number, I think, is complicated. If there are some number of people who have sufficient immunity but who don't have antibodies, then in fact the disease has spread further than that 20 to 25%, and maybe getting us closer to a level of spread that would provide some limited, at least, degree of herd immunity, because herd immunity is not something that happens just when you hit the threshold of 60%. It's a matter of, if more people in the population are protected, that means it's harder for the disease to spread, and therefore even in an unregulated way, it would spread slower than in a population that was totally, quote unquote, virgin. There are also really interesting questions around.
So just to be clear, to be clear on that, at least my understanding going into this, that you needed 60 to 70% of a population to have developed some form of immunity to it, whether it's by vaccination or by having been infected before and maintaining antibodies. But there are, I have been reading as of late that there is, you can have a form of herd immunity with numbers that are lower, depending upon, other factors that may take place. I mean, if
well, those are sort of two separate questions. The first is like, how many people in the community have been exposed, and does an antibody test tell you that, or does an antibody test underestimate the number of people who've been exposed? It seems to me likely that it underestimates it by some degree, although to what degree we don't yet know.
Right.
Then there's the question of whether herd immunity could be achieved at a spread, at a degree of spread that's like south of 60% of the particular community. And there is some open debate and conversation about this. I don't know exactly what to make of it, but there are serious people.
Right. It's hard to know whether or not that's aspirational.
Lower.
It's hard
Exactly.
to know whether or not that's aspirational at this point.
But the thing that's sort of most interesting to me, there have been a couple of recent papers just in the last day, and then some others over the last month or 6 weeks, have been about what's called about T cells, or one aspect of the immune system, and there have been some large-scale studies showing that a significant portion of the population who have not been exposed to COVID-19 have already a T cell immune response to it, which they've basically have because the disease is enough like other coronaviruses that those people have been exposed to, that the immune response is transferable. Now, we don't yet know what level of protection precisely that it's called cross-reactive immunity would offer. Some people I've spoken to suggest it could be quite dramatic and may even effectively eliminate the risk of severe disease. So you might get COVID, but you won't get really sick from it. Other people have been more measured and say the most we can say is that it would trigger a faster immune response and would probably mean a shorter period of symptomaticity. But even that would be good news. And, the measure of how many people have this is different studies have shown different things, but it seems likely that at least half the population has some amount of T-cell cross-reactive immunity. And that may mean, in a maximalist reading, trying to give you a little hope, that may mean that some significant portion of the people who haven't yet caught this disease are less at risk of the worst case outcomes than the people who we've seen experience those outcomes to this point. Now, that's very speculative. I don't know exactly what the likelihood that we land there is, but I think there's a lot of really interesting research around the immune response, the antibody response, and particularly the T-cell response that may somewhat dramatically change our sense of what the likely sort of future shape of the pandemic will be.
That is a derivation of the theory that applies also to the idea of in New York the response was completely bungled by Cuomo in moving patients into nursing homes. But there is some talk of the kindling, as it were, the most susceptible people to the disease have been impacted once it comes through a region, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that some people are able to what's called shed the virus more prolifically than others. There's some thinking that there may also be people who are more susceptible, and that may be tied up in this T-cell question, but it's not. It's all kind of speculative at this point. What's clear though is that it's quite striking that all around the world we've had all of these outbreaks in all of these different cities, which have all of these different levels and qualities of public health guidance and political leadership, who intervened at various points in the spread of the disease in those communities. And nowhere in the world have we seen serological surveys showing something more than 25% of the population exposed. Now, early on, especially when we're talking about flattening the curve and saving the hospitals, we heard a lot about the risks of exponential growth, that if a disease can double in size in 2 or 3 days, it can get unbelievably large very, very quickly. And in that period of exponential growth, implementing social distancing policies or advising mask wearing 2 days later or 3 days earlier can make an enormous difference in the ultimate scale of the outbreak. So given that dynamic, the fact that nowhere in the world has any city gone north of 25% does suggest to me that there may be some protective features going on that do sort of limit the ceiling of damage from COVID. I don't know enough. I don't think anybody knows enough to say for sure what those would be, but it is striking that nowhere in the world has the pandemic produced at least an antibody response in larger than a quarter of the local population.
That is fascinating, and I guess at this point, wearing a mask and grabbing onto anything that's hopeful is helpful. Let me just ask you two, 3 more questions that I think are people have generally. Why are deaths? Why are the deaths in places like Arizona and Texas, California, where we're seeing in Florida, where we're seeing this explosion of cases? Some of it is we're just more aware of how many cases there are. Some of it is it's a lagging indicator, although we have some distance here from that, so we would anticipate if we were like New York. Some of it is there's a awareness that hey, you don't put patients near nursing homes. You need to really lock down those communities. Some of it is, I would imagine, older people are that much more sensitive to it. What else do you think is, and we're seeing deaths creep up maybe accelerate even more than that. But what do you think is at play here?
Well, I think all of the factors you described. I think there are also treatments are improving. Like I said, they're improving at the margins, but that matters. And, I think we will likely see deaths, the absolute number of deaths in all of these places and across the country continuing to grow. But I do suspect that the trends will continue in that the sort of ratio of cases to deaths will grow, so that we'll have fewer deaths for the same number of cases that we saw earlier in the spring, for all of the reasons you describe. I mean, really big picture, something like half of all deaths in the U.S. from COVID-19 have been in nursing homes.
Right.
So just implementing common sense policies about how to protect those populations would make an enormous difference in the death rate. Beyond that, a clearer understanding of the vulnerable populations outside of nursing homes, people in their 70s and 80s and 90s, people who have, any number of these, comorbidities, transplant patients, cancer patients, et cetera. If those people have even a marginally better sense of how serious the disease is and what they need to do to protect themselves, that would help somewhat significantly. Maybe a little more speculatively, one of the hypotheses about why some people get a much worse version of the disease than others is about what's called the viral load, that if you're exposed to literally more viral particles, you may be much more likely to get a serious version of the disease. And if you're exposed to relatively fewer particles, you're likely to get a lighter version of the disease. Now, again, this is speculative, but if that is even a partial contributor to the matter of severity, then the fact that many, many more people are now wearing masks would mean that people would be getting a less severe form of the disease across the board. And I think that is, ultimately one of the chief failures of the American response. I talked earlier about testing and PPE, but ultimately the failure to advise early on that we all wear masks. In fact, for an extended period, we were advised against wearing masks.
Right.
Really is, I think, will prove to be a quite catastrophic failure. It wasn't unique to the U.S., but it had perhaps the worst impact here because we're now, because if we told everybody to wear masks in February, almost none of the country would have had to go into lockdown. Maybe New York would, maybe a few other places, but that was basically it. Because
and to be clear, when we say masks, we're not saying N95 masks. We're saying wear a bandana, wear anything that would have kept you as from projecting out the disease in as dense of a viral load or in as wide of a swath as possible. So with that said, tangentially, we are now weeks and weeks out from the some of the biggest protests in New York. They're still ongoing in many respects, but in terms of the big ones and the first times that they showed up, and there has been no noticeable bump in terms of infections that have led from that protest. A lot of protesters were wearing masks. They all took place outside. How much does outside versus inside have to do with what we're seeing in terms of like the Northeast now? We're still more or less either trending down or have stabilized on some level because people are outside more often. Very easy to do at this time of year in the Northeast. But in places like Florida, Arizona, and Texas, Southern California, people go inside to get air conditioning. How much of that is going on there? And what does that mean for, are we going to get another flip essentially come November?
Well, a lot depends on the population dynamics of a place like New York. If New York has already gotten enough, infection that there's some natural population level immunity or protection, that could really protect against what's happening in the fall. But big picture, I think outdoors, indoors is a huge part of this story. I think practically speaking, it's something close to impossible to get this disease outdoors. It's especially difficult to get it outdoors if you're, being pretty rigorous about social distancing and, trying to wear a mask when you're not social distancing. I think practically speaking, outside, it's more or less impossible to get the disease at all. It seems really easy to get the disease inside, especially in enclosed places where there isn't any fresh air, especially when you're in close proximity with other people. And the question of what that tells us about the fall, I think the risk that you're describing is real, but I also think it's likely that many of the situations in which we would be finding ourselves in close contact with other people in packed quarters inside, a lot of those are going to be suspended. Like, I don't think many people are going to be working in offices as they normally would have this fall anywhere in the country. I don't think that there are going to be bars open or restaurants open for indoor dining in many parts of the country. I don't think that there are going to be, concerts going on indoors, and I don't think we're going to be having, like NBA games or whatever where people are gathering 20,000 people in a building. I think all of that stuff is not going to be happening, which means that a lot of the places where you'd expect really bad spread to happen are sort of off the table. But it is obviously going to be harder to continue doing all the things that we want to do in the fall and into the winter outside in the northern parts of the country. And it's going to get considerably easier in the southern parts of the country, where today it is a lot harder. What that means for the spread of the disease, I think, has a lot to do with how we choose to respond to those conditions, how much we adapt our expectations for social gatherings, for professional work, and how much our, especially in the red parts of the country, but really all across the country, how much our disregard for scientific advice, how much we disregard that scientific advice.
All right. So lastly, let me ask you this, and you didn't bring this up, schools. What is LA and San Diego have closed theirs for starting in the fall anyways. I should say they're doing remote learning. Don't know how long that'll last. I imagine that is provisional. Andrew Cuomo talking about New York. New York City has the largest school district in the country. 1.4 million, 1.2 million students. Andrew Cuomo has basically set up at least benchmarks for what it takes to open a school and what it would take to close a school. I think 5% infection rate gets you opened if you're doing it for 14 days. 9% gets you shut down in a community, more or less. We're not clear exactly how that's happening, but what is your sense? Like, what because I keep hearing, I read reports that say, well, first of all, we have very few deaths with kids with kids under the age of 17. We hear that it's very difficult for young kids, let's say elementary school kids, to transmit. Yet, I saw a story in Syracuse a week ago where a daycare center, maybe 9-10 people got it because a woman came in waiting on a test. Saw a story about, I think it was a school in Texas this week. What's your sense?
Well, thinking globally, I think the facts you set out at the beginning are right. Kids are, practically speaking, not at risk for severe disease. There's some very small risk, but at a population level, it's practically speaking insignificant and not at a level at which public policy would intervene in any other context. I think that the transmission, our understanding of the transmission risks is a little more muddied than you suggest. I think we don't really know how well kids transmit it. It seems likely that they do it less effectively than teenagers, and teenagers less effectively than adults. But there's not zero transmission risk. The question is really about the relationship between the school and the community. And I think, most epidemiologists would tell you now the most important factor for whether schools can open in a particular community is not how the school is set up. It's not how the classrooms are arranged and whether they're face masks or plastic dividers or whether they double their school size or whatever, how much social distancing has been put into place, et cetera. the most important factor is how much disease there is in the community, because those kids are going to be going home to their parents every day. They're going to be seeing other family members. They're going to be interacting in the community, and as are, of course, the teachers and the staff at those schools otherwise. And because of the indoor dynamics that we were talking about earlier, schools represent a quite real risk. You can't do schools outside in New York City in January.
Right.
I do personally wonder why there wasn't more thought given to that in LA and San Diego, which do seem, at least from a weather perspective, like you could conceivably do some amount of school outside. Although, of course, there's also the matter of like real estate and space. But, my feeling is that when we look at Europe, they across the board have opened their schools now for a couple of months. And while there have been a couple of concerning flare-ups, it's really at the level of anecdote. It's like a school district here, a daycare center here. It's not like everywhere where schools have opened, there's been a disastrous flare-up of the disease. That to me suggests that generally speaking, at the sort of global population level, the most important that while there is some risk to schools, you can manage it, and most communities will be fine so long as the disease is really suppressed in that community. Unfortunately, in the U.S., there are going to be very, very few places where the disease is suppressed to that level, and that means that the risk is considerably greater. And, frankly, it seems, I wish that we were prioritizing the opening of schools much more than we have been, and invested in, say, building out new schools or claiming new real estate, hiring new teachers so we can make the class sizes smaller or whatever in order to make that happen. I also think, it doesn't seem impossible to roll out a kind of surveillance scale testing program within school systems, even if we're not able to do that across our country as a whole. If you look at what Harvard's doing, they're planning on testing their students every 3 days this fall in order to protect the on-campus experience, which they want to protect mostly for business reasons, but because they're such a well-endowed, rich institution with an on-site, scientific set of lab facilities that can actually run these tests, they're basically going to be running a medical surveillance state there, and that will be sufficient to protect the student body. We should, in theory, be able to do that in the New York City school system or the LA school system or the San Francisco school system or any place in the country if we were willing to spend the capital, political and literal, to do it. Unfortunately, we've gotten to a point now where it's like it's the middle of July and it seems like we're only just beginning to talk about this problem.
Yeah,
and I don't think there's really any hope that it's going to be solved come early September.
David Wallace-Wells, you're writing the first draft of a history, which I think historians are going to look back on this era and with I guess depending on the distance from today, with some laughter, but also just amazement at how tragically unnecessary so many of these deaths have been, and really just the immiseration that is bound to come in the wake of this, and maybe even during it. David Wallace-Wells, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Great to talk to you again.